All right, it's 6:05, so we'll now get started. So tonight's 40 Minutes of Competence is titled Cost versus Impact, Decoding LCA, Life Cycle Assessment, versus LCCA, Life Cycle Cost Analysis. Our special guest presenter tonight is Blaine Brownell. To give you all an introduction, he is an architect and researcher of emergent materials and sustainable building technologies. Blaine is also a professor and director of the David R. Raven School of Architecture at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Blaine is a former Fulbright scholar to Japan and has authored 9 books on advanced and sustainable materials for architecture and design, including Matter in the Floating World, Material Strategies, and the 4-volume Transmaterial series. He writes the Mind and Matter column for Architect Magazine, and his work has been published in over 70 architecture, design, science, and news journals, including the New York Times, the London Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Nature. His most recent book, The Pandemic Effect, addresses the inoculation of the built environment. If you have any questions throughout this session, please put them in the Q&A or chat, and we'll have a bit of time at the end to go through them. I'll keep track of our time. And with that introduction out of the way, I'm delighted to welcome Blaine to share his expertise on lifecycle costing and analysis. So the floor is now yours, Blaine.
Gwen, thank you so much, and welcome everyone to this virtual lecture. Hope you're having a good evening. And thank you to Amber Book for including me. I appreciate the opportunity. This is my first time speaking to your organization, and it's going to be a fun evening with you. As you can see here, we'll be talking this evening about life cycle assessment and life cycle cost analysis, which are 2 critical concepts to thinking about how to project overall impacts of a building from the beginning stages of design. I'll just launch into my slides here. So, and bear with me, for those who are really into the technical side of these types of methods or approaches, we will address those dimensions, but I also intentionally have included a number of kind of conceptual ideas, broad kind of ideas, just to frame the subject matter in perhaps a more interesting historical biological context, if that makes sense. So starting with this slide, life cycle as a concept, no surprise, comes from life cycle and biology, right? And so when we talk about building materials, buildings, cities as having a starting point and a use phase and then a demise, right? We're looking at biological analogies. When it comes to materials, and for this talk, we'll focus primarily on materials, right, of building products. Life cycle has those phases, but we look a lot at the birth of materials, which is really harvesting materials, and then how they're processed and used. And in architecture, we have things like the transportation, right, to the site and construction on the site and the use phase. And then we have the disposal phase, which we're trying to get away from pure disposal, right, because that is wasteful. We want to repurpose materials how we can. And then you can see that on the left side of the diagram. And in each phase, and this concept applies to life cycle cost analysis and life cycle assessment, right? There are a lot of things that apply to both, and we'll tease apart how they're different. You can see that at each phase, there are inputs and outputs, right? There is maintenance required during the use phase, for example, requiring more inputs, more resources, and at the same time, we discard things during each phase. That's just a reminder of that, and you can see emissions. And by the way, this chart comes from Mike Ashby. He's a materials scientist in Cambridge who wrote Materials in the Environment and many other books. I'm showing this chart. Normally, if we were all together in a space physically, I would try to make this more interactive with you and ask you questions that you could respond to. But and one question I would ask is if you're familiar with sand key diagrams. You probably have seen things like this or you're quite familiar. I like sand key diagrams because they help us visualize those phases of life of a material and material flows. In this case, we're looking in particular at weight. This isn't really LCA or LCCA, but it's just a diagram that reveals the amount of material by weight. In this case, it's steel, global flow of steel, right, through these different phases. So if you haven't used this on your projects, it can help if there's like a primary material that you're looking at, a primary structural material. I mean, it's not like you would really do this on every job, but it can be useful if there are like significant materials that you're trying to track in terms of the flows between phases. So now we'll get to the differences. Many of you might generally know the differences, or this might be your first time, I'm not sure, but I will dive in. Here is a kind of general summary of each of these methods, right? Life cycle assessment focuses on environmental impacts. And we look at the life cycle as explained before, from the beginning of raw material extraction through these different phases, you can read that, to the end of life disposal or recycling. And we will get into this. It quantifies these different indicators, including things like energy use, toxicity, et cetera. So the question that LCA answers is, what are the environmental consequences of this material or system over time, right? Now, life cycle cost analysis, as you either know well or intuit, focuses on economic performance. So what is this thing going to cost, right, in terms of the financial impacts? And those relevant costs can include, of course, they include the construction itself, but also the operation, the maintenance, replacement, disposal, et cetera. The question LCCA answers is, what will this material or system cost over its entire service life? Now, there's a lot of text here. So we're recording this for a future reference, so you can return to this slideshow. But there are standards, right? There are industry standards, the International Standards Organization or ASTM, that codify the methods, basically definitions and methods and procedures. Now, if you're like me or many architects, you won't necessarily have to dip into these standards that often, right? If ever, as long as you really understand once this becomes more habitual, right? And you are using certain tools that basically adopt these standards. It's not like you have to know these standards intimately, but it's just worth knowing where these different methods are codified, right? As like an industry standard of standard process and method and the different steps involved. And so you can see for LCA, the ISO series, that 14040 and 14044 deal with various environmental assessment methods. And again, we're evaluating environmental impacts. The indicators, I'll talk more about the indicators. And you all probably know environmental product declarations, or EPDs. These standards form the basis of those, right? So you'll hear a lot about EPDs if you haven't already in practice. LEED is increasingly using LCA. When I became lead AP in 2003, I'm dating myself, the early days of LEED, LCA was not part of LEED at that time. So increasingly, it's become more performance-based. LCCA is defined partially by ISO, but also ASTM, another standards, typical industry standard library. And the scope, you can see initial costs, operating costs, maintenance, et cetera. So you can see the life cycle phases are very similar, if not identical, depending on the method that you're looking at. And then outputs include economic assessment outputs, right? Net present value, internal rate of return, cost benefit ratios. So you're looking with LCCA at how much is this going to cost over time. And sometimes this is especially helpful if you're thinking about renovating a building and let's say you're adding insulation and you're thinking, is it worth it to add all this insulation? Well, you can estimate how much energy you're going to save over time, right? That would be internal rate of return. And that can tell you, is it worth this investment from a financial standpoint, right? So just to reiterate, LCA cares about the environmental impacts. LCCA cares only about financial, right? They're related. They're not completely, separate concerns. In fact, we'll see more about that. I'll keep going. Okay, let's look at concepts and trends. So this is where I like to look at big picture considerations. Now that we took a dive into ISO and ASTM, let's take a fresh look at these concepts. Okay, there was a recent study of about 100 buildings, I think, that went through a comprehensive assessment, LCA assessment. Although this has LCCA implications, right? Looking at the operational impacts, meaning, the cost to run the air conditioning, which could be environmental cost to run the air conditioning, right? Or financial cost. Embodied impacts. Embodied, if you've probably heard this term or know it well, has to do with, and it's a little misleading because it's not literally embodied, but it's basically the first cost of the materials, either environmental cost or the actual cost. Now, in this study, this was looking at environmental, I'll just say this was environmental impacts of these two, and they found that the operational impacts greatly overwhelmed or were significantly more of the total than the embodied impacts, right? Those first materials that you're specifying and that are built on a site in a building, they have a lot of these impacts that include everything from acidification to global warming potential. We'll get into the impacts. And the operational impacts are more significant. And this kind of makes sense, right? Think the building might take a year or two to build and has a lot of impacts, but if it lasts for 50 years, 100 years more, that's going to, and these were buildings studied over at least 100 years, which is why. Okay, what's interesting though, is the industry has attacked operational conservation first and foremost. So when we've heard phrases like net zero, when we've heard the early days of this latest wave of sustainability, and when I say that, I mean like early 2000s, right? The industry has really focused on reducing overall operational impacts. And that's in the regulatory environment, that's clients and owners, much more energy efficient, right? Primarily in the use phase. But what's interesting is as the operational impacts have shrunk, the embodied impacts not receiving the same kind of attention have become more significant. And so that's why in the last 10 years or so, and I'm throwing that out there, I don't know, 15, 10, that the embodied impacts have drawn more scrutiny. Like, we should also think about those, like the impacts of the first wave of materials and buildings. That makes sense. Has anyone seen this diagram? This is where interaction would be good, but if you haven't, this comes from the book by Stuart Brand called How Buildings Learn, and I highly, highly recommend this book. It is fascinating. And one might not necessarily think that a book about we love buildings, right? We love buildings, but maybe a layperson reading a book about buildings might not be the most fascinating thing in the world. Well, we think it is, right? But this book is hard to put down, actually. It's fascinating. So he talks about just studying buildings over their lifespans and how they change and how we really can't predict their futures. And one of the changes that's significant has to do with the different types of materials and systems, which he calls shearing layers of change. And you can see here, the site changes the least, and then through, structure, skin, services, space plan, and stuff. As you move through like the thinner line weights there, there's more frequent change. That makes sense, right? The overall structure and cladding of your house or the place where you work probably isn't going to change that much, but the furniture probably does. So he says, quote, because of the different rates of change of its components, a building is always tearing itself apart. Talk about drama, right? That's an interesting thing to envision. We don't think of buildings tearing themselves apart, or at least I don't, on a daily basis. But I mention this because it has to do with life cycle, right? Both cost and environmental impacts. So bear with me, I'm going to walk through this graph. This comes from Frank Duffy and Alex Henney in the book, The Changing City. They studied, so British architects, or at least Frank Duffy is, I know that, and they studied typical office building from this period over from 1990, over a 50-year period. So obviously we're projecting some of this based on past examples. But they estimate that, so let me talk about the colors here. So we're looking at 3 layers, right? Stewart Brand has several layers. We're looking at just 3 of those. So we're looking at structure is the black rectangles. Services are the solid orange rectangles. And then space plan includes a lot of the furnishings and furniture, right? In the lighter rectangles there. So 50-year period. And what he's showing us, this is kind of simplified, but he's showing that the structure doesn't change. The services do change. There's a churn of about 3 times, right? So 3 total times, including the first installation. So the services, they get old and obsolete and have to be completely replaced, right? Now the space plan is replaced every 5 to 7 years. So look at that. So if you look at the totals on the right, the cumulative total, and this is life cycle cost analysis, right? Because this is a cost assessment, is the changes to the original building cost 3 times more than the original building. And the bulk of that change are things that are not what we think of as the building primarily. Well, that's a little bit biased. I'm thinking like services, the HVAC system and the plumbing and, this kind of thing. We are typically, a lot of services we don't see, right? They're kind of the innards of the building. Furniture and space plan stuff we see, so that's visible change. But when we think about, we need to pay for this building, we're thinking of that initial, where it says 1990, traditional view of building costs. So this is LCCA, but there is an equivalent in LCA, right? Because the use phase, all those resource inputs and waste also come into effect. Okay, we're jumping into history class for a second. If you could bear with me, because I just want to put in a plug for how we even think about building longevity. And I'm not going to have enough time to spend with you on this, and I would love to have a dialogue about it because it's fascinating. But in the Western world, and I'm really generalizing here, but the Western canon, a building like the Parthenon is one that we would hold up as exemplary, right? It kind of represents our civilization in the West. And its original materials endure. It's a kind of a ruin now, right? It's being renovated. But those original materials, that originality is important. Whereas a culture like Japan, we're seeing the grand shrine at Ise. This shrine, although it is believed to have been initially built in 700 Common Era, something like that, maybe even earlier, has been rebuilt every 20 years. And if you don't know about the Ise shrine, there are actually multiple shrines. Each site has one building and an empty lot next to it. Towards the end of the 20-year cycle, a new building's built to the next, on to the side. And the old building, by then aged 20 years, is demolished entirely. So every 20 years, this thing is rebuilt. There is a longevity there. There's a duration, but the materials are entirely new. And so I think this is This is my little conceptual historical plug for thinking, right? Now, one would say as long as those materials are responsibly repurposed and recycled and reused in good ways, maybe that's okay, right? From an environmental standpoint and economic standpoint. I don't know. You be the judge. But I'm entering a phase where we're going to talk about the end of life of buildings and what we do with them. And this is kind of a nice segue. So if I could poll you easily, I would ask you all, how long would these primary materials last under normal conditions? Let's say their primary structure, load-bearing brick or masonry, concrete, steel, or wood, right? And your client's saying, I want my building to last 50 years or 30 years, 100 years, whatever. Do you know? Can you say, I'm going to specify a material that will do this for you, client? Think in your head how long each of these will last. This is a funny thing. We don't really know. We have examples of each of these materials lasting over 100 years in buildings. Some centuries, right? We've got wood structure. We've got examples. Concrete is relatively new and steel, but certainly masonry wood. But even concrete, like go to the Pantheon. What is that, 119 AD or something? Still there, right? These materials can last centuries, millennia, perhaps, depending on how they're built. This is a fascinating study by Jennifer O'Connor, at the time with Foreign Tech Canada Corporation, now with the Athena Institute, studied what caused the end of life of hundreds of buildings in American cities. And this particular study, she looked at Minneapolis, she looked at over 200 buildings, these primary materials, right, all of which could, in theory, last longer than 100 years. The average life of buildings was much shorter than that. Here's what's really fascinating. This is what led to the death of these buildings. Physical condition is a big one, but other things like area redevelopment, that's like zoning changes, no longer suitable for needs, fire damage, some other things. But here's what's interesting. Of the physical condition, there's one little tiny maroon wedge that's about 4%, really 3.5%, were buildings that were structurally not usable. All other buildings could be repaired. They could be retrofit. They could be upgraded, upfit to continue using them. So what's incredible to know is that despite the material robustness of these buildings, maybe need for maintenance, but only 3.5% of the study she found really needed to be torn down. So think about that when you're designing. If we don't design beloved buildings that people want to, and how do we do that, right? That's the big question that people will fight to save and keep maintaining, right? And sometimes those are torn down despite our best efforts. A lot of buildings, there's a lot of churn that we can't even predict, we can't control. And so I want to talk about this because life cycle assessment and life cycle cost analysis, they can't predict this stuff. So she says, the service lives of most buildings are probably far shorter than their theoretical maximum lives. Really quick, I want to talk about what happens after a building's demise, right? Or when materials enter the recycling stream. Mike Ashby looks at the financial aspects of this, right? In a free market, the materials that are recycled are those from which a profit can be made. I'm gonna try to describe this really quick. But you can look, if you look at consumption rate of materials over time, I'll try to simplify this. When products are in use, the longer that they're in use, the longer they're out of the material streams. So Mike, he's a huge proponent of recycling. And so this is an interesting way to think about material longevity as opposed to building longevity. he's not adverse to the idea that we recycle frequently, because the longer we don't recycle something, it's not contributing to the economy. And I think that's interesting concept. That was our moment to have the big ideas, and let's look at some methods here. Again, these slides will be shared with you, and they come from various sources I've referred to here, so you can refer back. So I'm going to try to be a little bit quick or summarize, but there are 4 steps to LCCA, life cycle cost analysis. Basically, what I would call the bookend steps, the first step and the end step, are about just being really thoughtful about what you're doing, right? So at the beginning, what do we want to assess? What are our goals? Makes sense, right? I think a lot of times we intuit those. We don't really necessarily write them down in this way, but we need to define the goals. And then the middle steps are where the action happens, right? The inventory, no surprise. You're doing takeoffs of plans, you're looking at the specifications, you're basically saying, how much concrete are we using, right? You're just taking an inventory. And then the third step is the most critical one, because then you're calculating a cost. And then the interpretation phase is, okay, what does all this mean? Hopefully that's pretty simple, because it also applies to life cycle assessment. Same thing. We're establishing our goals. What do we want to study? What do we care about? The inventory, in this case, is very similar. What kind of stuff are we specifying and using? And then similarly, third phase is the most critical, where we do the calculations, right? And that's where the methods are most important, really, to make sure we have accurate calculations, and then we interpret the data. So let's go through each phase. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus more on LCA, because life cycle cost is a much more established practice in professions and offices, and so and maybe more intuitive. And so I'm going to focus. Some of this is like life cycle cost, but I'm going to go more in depth on life cycle assessment, the environmental impacts, because offices are much less used to doing this. Is much less frequently done, right, in practice, but it will increase. So I think you all need to know about it. Let's look at goals and scope, that first step. So this, these are just examples. You can read them. We want to define the questions. What are we trying to do? So questions could be, this is a very common, which structural system do we want to use? Which will have the least impact environmentally, right? Or a specific product, like a flooring product. Maybe we don't want to use either carpet tile or vinyl tile. How do we know? The scope is you're defining what are we including and what are we not. If you include the world, you'll never get to the calculations, right? So this is where good wording is very important. What is the environmental impact of a steel structure during the construction phase, right? So we're looking in this case at one material and the type of use and a phase, like in what timeline. Does that make sense? Now let's get to the units themselves. A declared unit would be like thinking abstractly. Well, it's concrete, but you're thinking like so many board feet of wood or whatever, right? Whatever unit, cubic meters of concrete. But you could use these units in so many different ways that it doesn't really mean that much until you have the functional unit. In this case, this comes from Katrina Simonen's life cycle assessment book. So then you're looking at like wood siding, and we think we need to replace it every 30 years, and it needs to be 1 hour fire rated, and we need to maintain it with sealant every 5 years. So you're building, by those functional units, you're building in more realities of how this thing's actually going to be used, which is helpful. I won't read all this, but these are some examples, right? Siding, let's just look at the top. Wood siding, a declared unit might be 1 square meter which doesn't mean anything, really. And we wouldn't really use square meters, but anyway. Provide 1 square meter of exterior finish that conforms to typical residential aesthetic and provides UV light, water, fire, and impact protection for 50 years. For example, right? So this is where that scope, you're really defining what you're looking at. And some other examples. System boundaries. I referred to this briefly, but this is critical. So you see that system, if you can look at system boundary A, this comes from Ashby, that little innermost boundary is just looking at the product that's manufactured, right? It's in the factory, basically. What are the impacts environmentally? Inputs and outputs, what are the environmental impacts within that factory? Now, system boundary B thinks about the whole life cycle of that product. What happens when it's used? What happens when it's thrown away? And then what happens to that stuff? Now, system boundary C goes beyond that. That's looking at what happens to the tool, the fabrication tools that were used to make that product. How much of an impact do they have? What about the labor force involved in making the product or using it? What are their environmental impacts? So system boundary C is overwhelming, right? It's like it never ends. You know, you just like connect the dots between larger and larger circles. And so, but you can see that boundaries are really important to define, because if you don't define them, there comes a kind of unwieldy set of calculations. Here are a few different variations that you've probably heard about. Cradle to grave. This is an LCA from manufacture to the end, not recycling, but the end of life. Cradle to gate is within the factory, you know, beginning of life to when it leaves the factory. Cradle to cradle is where we want to be, right? With a holistic view, also called C2C, circular economy. You're thinking about the whole thing, et cetera, right? Gate to gate is just between different thresholds of use. This is kind of reinforcing what I'm saying. You're collecting data. This is from Katrina's book. In different ways, you're tracking the inputs and outputs, et cetera. So I mentioned impact assessments for LCA. The ones on the left are kind of industry standard. I'll go through them quickly. And then in addition, you might additionally have some of these like primary energy that you're tracking as well. And I'll go through them. Global warming potential. I don't think you need to know much about this because you already do. What I mean is hear more from me about it because you already know. Greenhouse gas emissions, right? Carbon dioxide equivalent are the units. So even things like methane and nitrous oxide, important greenhouse gases. Sometimes we make them equivalent to carbon dioxide to study the total impact of global warming. Acidification is really changing the chemistry of the oceans and basically the surface of the earth. Acid rain is also critical here. Eutrophication, if you don't know about this concept, you've seen it happen in water bodies where algae blooms significantly, and you have, it's weird to think that of nutrient pollution, we think of nutrients as good, but when it begins to crowd out or limit oxygen to get to fish and other wildlife, marine life, that's bad. Ozone depletion, you know about the hole in the atmosphere caused by solvents and refrigerants, etc. Smog, you know well. This is a study of ozone, ground level ozone. Related is another pollution metric is particle size. So we're thinking of respiratory health defined by the amount of small particles under PM 2.5. And those are the tiny little red particles that they're enlarged. You can see with how they relate to the size of a human hair. So they're so tiny, and these are the most harmful typically for us. And then we study things like megajoules worth of energy, fossil fuels, etc. So I covered the impacts really quickly, and we have to interpret the data. I'll just leave it at that. We need to look at how complete, what kind of units are we using? How are we being consistent? I wanted to talk about this a little bit. I know I've got just a couple minutes more here. LCA, LCCA also has drawbacks too, but I'm focusing on LCA because it's more novel. It's relatively new to the industry compared with life cycle cost analysis. LCA has these drawbacks, right? It is time consuming. It's often incomplete because you have to set these boundaries. So it's very hard to track everything in every use phase. The industry is gaining ability to judge LCA data better. We're gaining ability, but at the same time, there's a lot of learning. There's a big learning curve, and there's uncertainty and faulty precision can be used to disguise greenwashing. If you're like focusing, this thing performs great over here, but you're kind of ignoring the really bad thing, that has the worst impact. Anyway, doesn't mean LCA is bad. It just means be mindful of drawbacks with any tool or approach. So really quickly, and we won't do this now, but it's typical of an in-class exercise that I'll do, and I'll walk you through it, and Quinn will share the PDF that you can use in your own practice. Streamlined lifecycle assessment. So as Mike Ashby says, the detail required for a full life cycle assessment, environmental impacts, precludes its use as a design tool. And he's a huge environmentalist. So we need to have something that is streamlined. And if you were to look at these use phases of two materials, red and orange, just abstract, we don't know what the materials are, you can kind of get a sense of which one's worse. Right? We know the use phase is the longest phase. So let's say this is annual impacts. We know that red is much worse than orange. Right? This is very abstract, but I think you get the point. We can focus on kind of generalities, right? And rely on our intuition a little bit for some of this. So I'm going to show you this in a blitz. And this comes from Tom Gradle, who's an environmental scientist at Yale, an eco-audit assessment of these different phases. So what you're seeing is on the left, the rows are general environmental impacts. The columns are general use phases, and they use a score from 0 to 4. We'll share the slide deck with you so you can walk through it, or you can refer to Tom Gradle's article, Streamlined Lifecycle Assessment. And you basically score each of the phases of the material that you're looking at on this spider graph. Fun, I think this is fun. And you can see each use phase, not each use phase. Environmental impacts grab a wedge within each use phase. So if we were to look at concrete, I'm blowing through this, but you'll have this to refer to. It's more of a concept. Often concrete's biggest problem environmentally is with the cement clinker, right? Has huge embodied energy and embodied carbon. So you can see in the material side, energy use and global warming have the worst scores. In this case, 0 is the worst and 4 is the best. And by the way, this was kind of intuitive. This doesn't substitute for a full LCA, but the point is that you can, once you map these different scorings, you can see a graph basically that tells you like the material, like the different use phases, how the material performs. Little plug here as I wrap up. If you haven't used Athena Impact Estimator, this tool, I believe, is still free. It's been free thanks to the Athena Institute releasing it that way. I think it's still only for PCs, but you can do an online version of this tool. And this is separate from something like, here's another list. Here's a list of other tools like Tally, which is a plugin for Revit. Very, very, beneficial to have it as a plugin. But Athena, so Impact Estimator is separate, but allows you to input your units and your materials and get these impacts. And so now I'm ready to answer questions finally.
Looking through our chat, we have one question, but it looks like Ralph did chime in a bit, but maybe you can add your own comments. It reads, how does building envelope changes, such as roofing, compare to services and space plan? Are they part of the structure? And this is probably related to that diagram you showed near the start of your talk. And Ralph chimed in here saying, skin changes more frequently than structure, but slightly less frequently than services or space plans. And it did show as its own layer in the diagram you also shared.
Ralph is absolutely right, which doesn't surprise me that Ralph will be right. But a little bit of backstory, Frank Duffy's study, in his study, he was including what we call shell and core, right? So he was being really almost too, not specific enough, like combining the skin and the structure and the foundation. I mean, we normally don't do those things. But Frank's career was really, he was more of an interior architect. And so that explains a little bit of the mindset. He's more focused on what's happening on the inside of the shell and apart from the structure. But as you saw in the previous diagram that Stuart Brand, in Stuart Brand's book, he does talk about the skin as a separate layer. So we could do that, right? We could take Frank's study and basically add the skin and the stuff. He also did include stuff, which changes the most, right? It's like all of our peripheral things and plants and whatever that we're moving, like stuff we would move in and out very frequently. But good question. Can I talk about passive house certification? That would be another type of method it would be really interesting to apply LCA and LCCA thinking to. I don't have much time to talk about it, but what I would say is that passive house fascinates me. It makes so much sense, especially in most climates, but in some cultures, it doesn't. And I will just say from my experience living in Japan, traditional Japanese architecture is the opposite of passive, right? It's active. It's shoji screens opening. It's all about ventilating the interior as much as you can, not insulating the walls. I'm talking about historic. In the north, yes, there are different methods, but let's say in more southern regions of Japan, the history is it's like active house, right? You're actively moving things around to get the most ventilation and air the house out. And from a human health perspective, that's healthier typically, right? But you have to condition the body. And that's what's really interesting is like little heaters and thick robes and things to heat the body. And so when we lived in Japan, we lived in a house that was not insulated. It leaked, and so we lived this life, and it wasn't always pleasant, but it was fascinating. So I'm not saying everyone should live like that, but I think passive house makes perfect sense. But it's that human health aspect of making sure you have enough fresh air that we learned in the pandemic was especially important. That passive house, that's kind of the weak link of passive house. I'm a fan of it. It makes so much sense, but that's where we have to really look at.
All right, so it's 7 o'clock, so I think we have to put a hard stop on this. Thank you again, Blaine, for speaking tonight. And like we always say, though this session is a bit special compared to our usual study sessions, good luck, good night, and get licensed.